Hi, Lisa. Thanks for emailing me about your Excel questions. They're so intriguing. I love it. So in this video, I'm going to try to tackle the first scenario that you laid out. And if I understand it correctly, you're seeking to create a macro that will move any given worksheet to a new workbook. So let's go ahead and do it, and I'll talk about some macro things as we go along the way. You might already know them, but I'm just going to say them just to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so first things first, I have the workbook open already before I start recording. So any given macro is going to record every single action that you take. And so you really want to think about the steps that you perform once you start recording, because any individual step could create an error message, and the act of opening a specific workbook might be one of those things that causes an error message because the macro might not understand where to go. It depends on how you do the open. So let's not include that in the macro. Let's have the workbook open, and then I'm going to record a macro. So here we go. I'm going to do the record. We'll call it macro 2, whatever you want to name it, right? And we'll click OK. All right, so now I'm going to move this sheet to a new workbook. So notice that my sheet is named Sheet 1, right? That's sort of the generic name that we see a lot. I'm going to do a right click and move or copy. However you want to do the move is fine with me. And I'll say New Book, and I'll click OK. It'll move it. So now I have 2 books open. I have my original and I have this new one where it got moved to. I'm just going to go back and I'm going to stop recording. Okay, so another thing to think about is that because your macro is recording specific actions, it's moving the sheet named Sheet 1. So in order for this macro to run again, I have to have a sheet named Sheet 1. So I'm back here in my original. Sheet 1 already got moved, so I'm going to rename this guy Sheet 1. Oops, let me try that again, sorry. My mouse got away from me. There we go. It has to be named exactly the same thing because that's what the macro is looking for. So now that I have it named Sheet 1, I'm going to run that macro. And it'll go. It starts a new book, so now I have another new book. And then notice when I run the macro, it takes me back to my original, because that's where I had to go to say stop. So it takes me back to my original. But I have 2 now new sheets, each with an individual Sheet 1. Is how that plays out. So that's kind of the bummer. It's good news, but it's not great news. Like, we can get the macro to work, but there's no way that I know of, that I can think of off the top of my head. I shouldn't say there's no way. I just can't think of it off the top of my head how to record that macro so that it just moves the existing sheet, whatever sheet that happens to be the active sheet. I can't think of how to do that. Right? Because it'll always identify, when you say move, that move command is always going to identify a sheet name. And in fact, we can look at that, if you look at your macro code, you'll be able to see here, see where it says the one that's selected is this one named Sheet 1, and that's the one that it moves. So I don't know if tech services, if anybody knows Excel a little bit better, that they could identify that. I can't think of how to get it. Because in order to use the move command, you have to tell it what to move, and so I wouldn't know how to get it to understand just move any generic sheet. Okay, so anyway, sorry. Good news, not great news. I hope it's at least a little bit helpful to get you maybe a step closer. As I think about it, if you're working with data, if you're bringing in data and then moving it to other sheets, right, as you bring in data, that, right, you can just dump it into Sheet 1 every time. So bring in data, have it be in Sheet 1, move it to its own workbook. So you might think about that, sort of setting up the data before you run the macros to get the macro to work, right? You always want to think about it in steps. I don't know. I hope that helps. Okay, good luck.